In the summer of 1812, Europe witnessed the beginning of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. A man who had conquered almost the entire continent was preparing for his most ambitious victory yet. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. For more than a decade, Napoleon had been unstoppable. His armies had defeated Austria, Prussia, and countless other enemies. Kingdoms fell before him, borders changed, European rulers feared his power. To many people, Napoleon seemed almost invincible. But in 1812, he made a decision that would eventually destroy everything he had built. He decided to invade Russia. At first, the plan looked simple. Napoleon believed he would march into Russian territory, defeat the Russian army in one decisive battle, capture Moscow, and force Emperor Alexander I to surrender. This strategy had worked many times before. In previous wars, Napoleon's greatest weapon was speed. He would move quickly, overwhelm his enemies, destroy their armies in a single massive battle, and force them to negotiate peace. But Russia was not like the countries Napoleon had defeated before. It was enormous, it was unpredictable, and it had a strategy that would slowly destroy the greatest army Europe had ever seen. The conflict between France and Russia had been growing for years. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon and Alexander I were officially allies, but their relationship was fragile. Napoleon wanted Russia to completely obey his economic blockade against Britain. He wanted every European nation to stop trading with the British Empire, but Alexander I refused to fully follow Napoleon's demands. Russia depended heavily on trade, and the Russian Emperor was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with France's growing influence across Europe. Napoleon saw Russia's actions as a challenge to his authority. He believed that if Russia remained independent, other nations would eventually rebel against French domination. To Napoleon, defeating Russia was not just another military campaign. It was necessary to protect his empire, so he began preparing for war. In 1812, Napoleon created what became known as the Grande Armée, the largest military force Europe had ever seen. It was not just a French army. Soldiers came from across the continent. French troops marched alongside Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, Swiss, and many other soldiers from territories controlled by Napoleon. The army numbered more than 600,000 men. It was a terrifying force. Thousands of cannons rolled behind endless columns of infantry. Hundreds of thousands of horses carried soldiers, supplies, and equipment. The ground shook beneath the movement of the massive army. Many European observers believed Russia had no chance. How could any country defeat such a force? Napoleon himself was confident. He expected a short campaign. He believed that one major victory would end the war. His plan was based on a simple idea: find the Russian army, destroy it, capture Moscow, force peace. But the Russian commanders had a completely different plan. They understood something Napoleon did not. They did not need to defeat him immediately. They only needed to survive. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's army crossed the Neman River and entered Russian territory. The invasion had begun. The soldiers marched forward with confidence. Many believed they were walking toward another glorious victory. But almost immediately, problems appeared. The Russian army refused to fight. Instead of standing and defending every city, Russian commanders began retreating deeper into their own territory. At first, Napoleon was confused. He expected the Russians to make a stand. He wanted a decisive battle that would end the war. But the Russians disappeared into the endless landscape.
Every day the French army marched farther. Every day the Russians withdrew. The French soldiers began asking the same question: where is the Russian army? Nobody knew. The deeper Napoleon moved into Russia, the more difficult the campaign became. The distances were enormous. Roads were terrible. The summer heat was exhausting. Thousands of horses died from hunger and exhaustion. Supply wagons struggled to keep up with the army. Food became harder to find. The French army was moving faster than its own supplies. Napoleon had always depended on capturing enemy resources after victories, but Russia offered him almost nothing. Villages were abandoned, food stores were destroyed, fields were burned. The Russians were leaving behind an empty land. This strategy became known as the scorched earth policy. Its purpose was simple. If the French army could not feed itself, it would eventually weaken and collapse. Many French soldiers did not understand what was happening.
They had entered Russia expecting a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves chasing an enemy that refused to fight. As weeks passed, Napoleon's enormous army began to shrink. Some soldiers became sick, others deserted, thousands suffered from exhaustion, and they had not even reached the main Russian forces. In August 1812, Napoleon finally approached the city of Smolensk. Here, the French expected to find supplies and a major victory. Instead, they found another surprise. The Russians fought fiercely, but eventually abandoned the city. Before leaving, they destroyed important supplies. When French soldiers entered Smolensk, they discovered that much of what they needed was gone. The city was damaged, the warehouses were empty. The victory brought little reward. For the first time, many French officers began to understand the danger of the campaign. They were winning battles, but they were losing the war. Napoleon, however, remained confident. He believed the Russians could not retreat forever. Sooner or later, they would have to fight, and when that moment came, he would destroy them. The French emperor continued moving east. Behind him stretched hundreds of kilometers of difficult territory. Ahead waited the Russian army. But what Napoleon did not realize was that every step deeper into Russia was bringing his army closer to disaster. The Russians were not running away, they were preparing a trap. And soon Napoleon would face the battle he had been waiting for, a battle that would decide the fate of his invasion, a battle that would become one of the bloodiest moments of the Napoleonic Wars. After the capture of Smolensk, Napoleon Bonaparte expected the war to finally reach its decisive moment. He had marched thousands of kilometers into Russian territory, his army had crossed rivers, survived terrible roads, and endured extreme exhaustion. Yet the Russian army continued to retreat. For Napoleon, this was becoming impossible to understand. He had always won by forcing his enemies into battle. His greatest victories came when opposing armies stood before him on an open battlefield. There, his genius as a commander could destroy them in a single crushing blow. But Russia refused to play by his rules. The Russian commanders understood something Napoleon did not. Time was their greatest weapon. Every day the French army moved deeper into Russia, it became weaker. Every kilometer stretched the supply lines. Every abandoned village reduced their chances of finding food. Every week increased sickness and exhaustion among the soldiers. The Russians did not need to defeat Napoleon immediately. They only needed to survive. However, inside Russia, many people were angry. They could not understand why the army kept retreating. Cities were being abandoned, villages were being lost. The enemy was moving closer to Moscow. Many officers and nobles demanded a direct confrontation. They wanted a commander who would stop retreating and finally challenge Napoleon. This pressure led Emperor Alexander I to appoint a new commander of the Russian army. His name was Mikhail Kutuzov. Kutuzov was already a legendary military figure. He had fought against Napoleon before and understood his methods. When soldiers heard that Kutuzov had taken command, many believed that the moment of revenge had arrived. Finally, Russia would fight back. But when Kutuzov arrived, he made a surprising decision. He continued the retreat. Many were shocked. Why would the new commander refuse to fight? But Kutuzov understood the reality of the situation. The French army was still extremely powerful. A careless battle could destroy Russia's last hope. The Russian army needed the right battlefield, a place where they could use the landscape to their advantage. That place was near a small village called Borodino. Located about 125 kilometers from Moscow, Borodino became the location of the battle that would decide the fate of Napoleon's invasion. The Russians quickly began preparing defensive positions. Soldiers built earthworks, trenches, and artillery positions. Thousands of men worked day and night, knowing that a massive confrontation was approaching. Meanwhile, the situation inside the French army was becoming worse. The soldiers who had crossed into Russia full of confidence were now exhausted. The summer heat had been brutal. The roads were destroyed by constant movement. Rain turned paths into oceans of mud. Food became scarce. Horses died by the thousands. Without horses, the French could not move their artillery or supplies. Many soldiers were already suffering from disease before the first major battle even began. But Napoleon refused to believe the campaign was failing.
He was convinced that one victory would change everything. He told his generals that after defeating the Russian army, Alexander I would have no choice but to negotiate. The emperor believed history was repeating itself, but Russia was different. On September 7, 1812, the two armies finally met at Borodino. The battlefield was filled with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The largest armies Europe had ever seen prepared for one of the bloodiest battles of the 19th century. At sunrise, the French artillery opened fire. The sound was terrifying. Thousands of cannons thundered across the battlefield. The ground shook. Smoke covered the fields. Then the French infantry began their advance. Their first target was the Russian left flank, where powerful defensive positions known as the Bagration flashes had been built. The fighting was brutal. French soldiers attacked again and again. Russian troops defended every meter of ground. The positions changed hands multiple times. Entire units disappeared within minutes under artillery fire. Soldiers fought with muskets, bayonets, and swords. The battlefield became a nightmare of smoke, fire, and chaos. General Pyotr Bagration personally led the Russian defense. He inspired his soldiers by remaining on the front lines, but during the fighting he was badly wounded. His injury became a devastating blow for the Russian army. At the same time, another critical battle was taking place around the great redoubt of General Raevsky. This powerful Russian position became the center of the battlefield. Wave after wave of French troops attacked. The Russians resisted with incredible determination. Cavalry charges crashed into infantry formations. Cannons fired at extremely close range. Thousands of men fell within hours. Napoleon watched the battle from a distance.
The officers expected him to make a decisive move. They wanted him to send in the Imperial Guard, his strongest and most experienced troops. The Imperial Guard had saved Napoleon many times before. Their arrival could have broken the Russian lines. But Napoleon hesitated. He feared that the Russians might still have hidden reserves. He refused to risk his elite soldiers. This decision remains one of the most debated moments of his career. As the sun began to set, the battlefield was covered with the dead and wounded. The destruction was enormous. Around 70,000 to 80,000 soldiers from both sides were killed or wounded. It was one of the bloodiest single-day battles in European history. Technically, Napoleon had won. The Russians withdrew. The battlefield remained in French hands. But it was not the victory Napoleon needed. The Russian army had not been destroyed. Kutuzov had achieved his main goal. He had survived, and that meant the war continued.
Napoleon looked across the battlefield and saw what appeared to be a path to victory. The road to Moscow was open. The ancient Russian capital was ahead. The emperor believed that once Moscow fell, Alexander I would surrender. He imagined a peace treaty. He imagined another great triumph. But Napoleon did not understand one crucial thing. Moscow was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of his greatest disaster. The Russian army was still alive. The Russian people were still fighting. And the city that Napoleon was about to capture would give him no victory, only a trap.
After the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon Bonaparte finally achieved what he had been waiting for. The Russian army had retreated. The road to Moscow was open. For the French emperor, it seemed like the final stage of the campaign had arrived. He had defeated armies across Europe. He had captured capitals before. Now the legendary city of Moscow was within his reach. Napoleon believed that everything would happen according to his plan. The Russians would be forced to surrender. Emperor Alexander I would ask for peace. The war would end. But history was about to take a completely different direction. After Borodino, the Russian army faced a difficult decision. Should they defend Moscow at all costs, or should they preserve their army and continue the fight? For many Russians, abandoning Moscow seemed impossible. The city was more than just a place. It was the ancient capital of Russia, a symbol of national identity, a spiritual center filled with churches, traditions, and history. Giving it to Napoleon without another battle seemed like a national tragedy. But General Kutuzov understood the situation. The Russian army had survived Borodino, but it had suffered enormous losses. Another battle could destroy the army completely, and if the army disappeared, Russia would have no way to continue the war. On September 14, 1812, Russian commanders gathered at the village of Fili to decide the fate of Moscow. The discussion was intense. Some generals demanded another battle. They wanted to defend the city. Others understood that survival was more important than pride. Kutuzov remained silent for a long time. Then he made his decision. Moscow would be abandoned. His famous words reflected his strategy. If the loss of Moscow saves the army, then Russia is not lost. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life. The Russian army withdrew, and with it went the people of Moscow. Thousands of civilians left the city. Nobles, merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary families packed whatever they could carry and escaped. The streets filled with endless lines of wagons. People left behind homes, businesses, and entire lives. When Napoleon's army approached Moscow, they expected a traditional surrender. In European wars, when an enemy captured a capital city, officials usually appeared with the keys to the city. The population accepted defeat. But Moscow was different. When Napoleon entered the city on September 14, 1812, nobody greeted him. No government officials appeared. No delegation offered peace. The streets were almost empty. Napoleon stood and looked at the city. The Kremlin towers rose in the distance. Golden church domes reflected the sunlight. To his soldiers it looked like a symbol of victory. They believed the war was over. But Napoleon soon realized something was wrong. Moscow was silent. The city had been abandoned. The French soldiers searched houses for supplies.
They expected to find food, weapons, and resources. Instead, they found emptiness. The victory they had dreamed of felt strangely meaningless. And then came the disaster. During the night, fires began breaking out across Moscow. At first, many French soldiers believed they were accidents, but soon flames appeared in different parts of the city at the same time. The wind grew stronger. The fire spread rapidly. Wooden buildings became fuel. The sky turned black with smoke. Within hours, Moscow was burning. The French tried to stop the destruction, but there was a serious problem. Many firefighting tools had been removed or destroyed before the French arrived. There was not enough water. The flames continued spreading. Napoleon was forced to leave the Kremlin temporarily because the fire became too dangerous. For several days, Moscow remained surrounded by fire. The city that was supposed to become Napoleon's greatest prize was being destroyed before his eyes. Historians still debate exactly how the fire began. Some believe Russian authorities ordered the destruction to prevent the French from using the city. Others argue that the fire was caused by chaos, accidents, and soldiers searching for supplies. But the result was the same. Napoleon had captured Moscow. Yet Moscow gave him almost nothing. No food, no supplies, no surrender, no peace. The emperor waited. He believed Alexander I would eventually realize that resistance was pointless. Napoleon sent messages offering negotiations, but the Russian emperor refused to answer. Days passed, then weeks. Still, no peace agreement came. Alexander I understood the situation perfectly. As long as Napoleon remained in Moscow, his army was becoming weaker. Every day was helping Russia. Meanwhile, life inside the French camp became increasingly difficult. The soldiers lacked proper supplies, horses were dying, food was disappearing, discipline was beginning to collapse. The French army was trapped in a destroyed city hundreds of kilometers from its homeland. Outside Moscow, a new type of war was developing. Russian partisans began attacking French supply groups. Small French detachments sent out to search for food were ambushed. Couriers carrying messages were captured. Roads became dangerous. The French could no longer move freely. Cossack units became especially feared. They attacked suddenly, destroyed enemy groups, and disappeared before the French could respond. For Napoleon soldiers, there was no safe place. The enemy was everywhere. Autumn arrived. The weather became colder. Rain turned roads into mud. The army desperately needed to leave. Many French generals warned Napoleon that staying in Moscow was becoming a disaster. The emperor finally understood the truth. Russia would not surrender. Alexander I would not negotiate. The campaign had failed. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon gave the order to leave Moscow. The army began its retreat. But the journey back would be far worse than the march forward. The road that had brought Napoleon glory would now become the road of destruction.
The French soldiers were not returning as conquerors, they were retreating through an enemy land that wanted them gone. Winter was approaching, supplies were running out, and waiting ahead was the most terrifying chapter of Napoleon's Russian campaign. The destruction of the Grand Army had begun.
On October 19, 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte finally made the decision he had tried to avoid for weeks. The French army was leaving Moscow. The city that was supposed to bring victory had become a trap. Napoleon had entered Russia with dreams of destroying the Russian Empire and forcing Emperor Alexander I to surrender. Instead, he was leaving with a weakened army, empty supplies, and a war that was far from over. But Napoleon still believed he could save the campaign. His new plan was to move south toward the city of Kaluga. The region was rich in food and supplies. If the French army could reach it, they might be able to recover, rest, and survive the winter. But the Russians had already predicted this move. Kutuzov understood that Napoleon's greatest weakness was not his army, it was his supply system. The French could fight, they could win battles, but they could not survive without food. The Russians blocked Napoleon's path south.
On October 24, 1812, the two armies clashed near the town of Maloyaroslavets. The battle was brutal. The small town changed hands several times. French and Russian soldiers fought through burning streets. Buildings collapsed around them. The ground was covered with the dead and wounded. The French eventually captured the town, but Napoleon realized that continuing south would lead to another major battle against a prepared Russian army. He faced a difficult choice: risk another fight with exhausted troops, or return along the same devastated road he had already used during the invasion. Napoleon chose the second option. It was a decision that sealed the fate of the Grand Army. The French army now had to retreat through the same territory they had destroyed months earlier. There were no supplies waiting for them, no fresh food, no warm shelters, only empty villages and ruined fields. The army that had entered Russia as the greatest military force in Europe was now fighting simply to survive. The first signs of disaster appeared immediately. The weather became colder. Heavy rains turned roads into rivers of mud. Then came the freezing temperatures. Many soldiers had no winter clothing. They wrapped themselves in blankets, pieces of cloth, and anything they could find. At night, thousands gathered around small fires. Some soldiers fell asleep near the flames and never woke up. Others froze while walking. But the cold was not the only enemy. The French army had already been weakened before winter arrived. Months of marching, hunger, disease, and exhaustion had destroyed its strength. The winter simply delivered the final blow. The once disciplined French army began to collapse. Soldiers abandoned their weapons because they were too heavy. Cannons were left behind because there were no horses strong enough to pull them. Military equipment that had taken months to prepare was abandoned on Russian roads. The army was slowly losing everything. The greatest symbol of Napoleon's power was disappearing piece by piece. The Russian forces followed closely, but they did not need to destroy Napoleon in one great battle. The French army was destroying itself. Russian cavalry, especially the Cossacks, became a constant nightmare. They attacked isolated groups, captured supplies, and destroyed communications. French soldiers feared leaving the main column. A man who walked only a short distance away from the army could easily disappear forever. The Russian peasants also played an important role. Many villages had been destroyed before the French arrived. The population refused to help the invaders. Instead, local fighters attacked small French groups and provided information to Russian commanders. The French were surrounded by enemies. Every road was dangerous. Every forest could hide an attack.
Every abandoned village represented another lost chance for survival. By November, the situation became catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers were sick, thousands were starving, many had lost their uniforms and weapons. The proud soldiers of Napoleon's Grand Army were becoming a desperate crowd of survivors. The final great test came at the Berezina River. By late November, Napoleon's army was trying to cross the river, while Russian forces moved to surround them. The Russian commanders believed they finally had the opportunity to destroy Napoleon completely. If the French were trapped at the river, the entire army could be captured. But Napoleon's engineers performed an extraordinary achievement. Under freezing conditions and constant danger, French engineers built 2 temporary bridges across the icy river. Many of them worked in freezing water, knowing they might not survive.
Their sacrifice allowed thousands of soldiers to escape. But the crossing quickly turned into chaos. Thousands of exhausted troops, wagons, horses and civilians rushed toward the bridges. The narrow crossings became scenes of panic. People pushed forward desperately. Wagons overturned, horses fell into the freezing water, many soldiers drowned. Russian attacks continued around the bridge. The French managed to escape, but the cost was terrible. Thousands were left behind. Many wounded soldiers were abandoned. For those who survived, the Berezina became a symbol of suffering. The Grand Army was no longer the force that had crossed into Russia months earlier. It was a shadow of its former self. In early December, Napoleon received alarming news from France. Political problems were growing. Rumors spread about attempts to challenge his authority. The emperor knew he had to return immediately. On December 5, 1812, Napoleon made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. He left the army. With a small group of officers, he traveled quickly toward France.
He left command of the remaining troops to his generals. For many soldiers, it was a devastating moment. Their emperor had abandoned them. But Napoleon believed that saving his empire required his presence in Paris. The remaining soldiers continued their march west. When they finally crossed back over the Neman River, the disaster became clear. The invasion that began with more than 600,000 men had ended with only a fraction of that number surviving. Hundreds of thousands were dead, captured, missing, or permanently lost. Napoleon had entered Russia as the most powerful ruler in Europe. He left it with his empire damaged beyond repair. The world had witnessed something unbelievable. The man who had defeated kings and conquered nations had been defeated by a combination of distance, strategy, exhaustion, and resistance. But the question remained, how could the greatest military commander of his age make such a catastrophic mistake? Why did Napoleon lose Russia? The answer was more complicated than one battle or one winter. It was a combination of decisions that slowly destroyed his greatest achievement.
In December 1812, the world witnessed something that seemed impossible. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had conquered most of Europe, had suffered his greatest defeat. The French emperor entered Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen. More than 600,000 soldiers marched under his command. They carried the flags of France, Poland, Italy, Germany, and many other territories controlled by Napoleon. They believed they were marching toward another glorious victory. But only a small fraction returned. The Grand Army had been destroyed. For centuries, people have asked the same question. Why did Napoleon lose Russia? Was it because of the Russian winter? Was it because of the Russian army? Was it because of Napoleon's mistakes? The truth is that the disaster was caused by many factors working together. The Russian winter played a role, but it was not the only reason. By the time the cold became truly severe, Napoleon's army was already collapsing. The destruction had started months earlier. The first major mistake Napoleon made was underestimating the size and nature of Russia itself. Napoleon was used to fight in wars in Central Europe. There, armies could move quickly between cities. Supplies were easier to obtain. A defeated enemy usually surrendered after losing a major battle. But Russia was different. It was enormous. The distances were almost impossible for a European army to imagine. The farther Napoleon moved east, the longer his supply lines became. Food, weapons and reinforcements had to travel hundreds of kilometers. Every mile weakened the French army. Napoleon's second mistake was believing that Russia would fight the same way as his previous enemies. He expected a decisive battle. He wanted the Russian army to stand and be destroyed. Instead, Russian commanders refused to follow his plan. Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov understood that time was on their side. They did not need to defeat Napoleon immediately.
They needed to preserve their army and force the French deeper into Russia. Every retreat damaged Napoleon's position. Every day weakened his soldiers. The Russians turned the size of their own country into a weapon. The third reason was the scorched earth strategy. As Russian forces retreated, they destroyed resources that could help the invaders. Food supplies were removed, fields were burned, villages were abandoned. The French army entered Russia expecting to survive by taking supplies from the land, but there was almost nothing left to take. The traditional Napoleonic strategy failed. Victory no longer brought resources, it only brought more empty territory.
The fourth reason was logistics. Many people remember the freezing temperatures, but fewer remember the enormous logistical problems. An army of hundreds of thousands of men required enormous amounts of food, equipment, and transportation. The French simply could not maintain such a massive force so far from home.
Thousands of horses died. Without horses, artillery became useless. Without supplies, soldiers became weaker every day. A powerful army without food was no longer powerful. It was simply a group of exhausted people trying to survive. The fifth reason was disease. Long before the winter arrived, thousands of French soldiers were already sick. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, exhaustion, and hunger created perfect conditions for disease. Many soldiers died without ever fighting in a major battle. The Grand Army was losing strength every day. The sixth reason was the Russian resistance. The French expected that many people would accept Napoleon's rule. Instead, they faced growing hostility. Russian peasants refused to cooperate. Local fighters attacked small French groups. Supply missions became dangerous. The French army was constantly threatened. Cossack cavalry became especially effective. They avoided unnecessary battles but attacked whenever they saw weakness.
They destroyed supply lines, captured prisoners, and created fear among French soldiers. The seventh and perhaps most important reason was Napoleon himself. Napoleon was a brilliant military commander. His victories were based on speed, surprise, and decisive action. But in Russia, these strengths became weaknesses. He refused to accept that the campaign was failing. After capturing Moscow, Napoleon waited too long. He believed Alexander I would negotiate, but Alexander never surrendered. The longer Napoleon stayed in Moscow, the worse his situation became. The city gave him no victory, no peace, no supplies. It only trapped his army deeper inside enemy territory. Leaving earlier might have saved many soldiers, but Napoleon waited until escape became extremely difficult. The Russian campaign changed everything. Before 1812, Napoleon seemed unbeatable. European nations feared him. Many believed resistance was impossible. But after the destruction of the Grand Army, something changed.
Other countries realized that Napoleon could be defeated. Prussia, Austria, Russia, and other powers began forming new alliances against France. The defeat in Russia became the turning point of the Napoleonic Wars. In 1813, Napoleon faced a new coalition of enemies. The massive Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, became one of the largest battles in European history. Napoleon was defeated. His empire began collapsing. In 1814, enemy armies entered Paris. For the first time in years, Napoleon lost control. He was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Although he would briefly return to power in 1815, his final defeat came at Waterloo. His era of domination was over. But the story of the Russian campaign remained unforgettable. It became one of the greatest examples of how even the strongest army can fail, not because of one enemy, not because of one battle, but because of a combination of strategic mistakes, impossible distances, determined resistance, and human limits. Napoleon entered Russia believing that power alone could defeat a nation. He discovered that courage, patience, geography, and determination could be stronger than any army. The invasion of 1812 was not just a military defeat, it was the moment when the myth of Napoleon's invincibility was destroyed. A man who had defeated emperors, kings, and armies across Europe finally met an opponent he could not conquer. Russia did not defeat Napoleon in one single battle. It defeated him slowly, step by step, day by day, until the greatest army in Europe disappeared into the frozen landscape. And that is why Napoleon's invasion of Russia remains one of the most dramatic stories in military history. A story of ambition, a story of survival, a story of how the greatest victories can sometimes lead to the greatest disasters.